My name is Marvin Lynn. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development upstairs. This academic year, the Chancellor's Office and the Center for Community Safety and Resilience in the School of Public Affairs have partnered to sponsor a series of 4 events on gun violence. This partnership was formed as part of a CU Denver initiative to address gun violence and its intersections and to inform and inspire our local community. So tonight's event is the first in that series. On behalf of Sheila Huss and Desiree Crow, who are the co-directors of the Center for Community Safety and Resilience, and they're also professors in the School of Public Affairs, I'd like to take a minute to thank the Chancellor's Office, the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Dean Paul Teskey, in his absence, and Turan Kayugulo, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Affairs in the Provost Office. Provost is also here, thank you. Sarah Engel, from the Strategic Plan Implementation Team. Dr. Francie Kreppel-Hobson, one of our panelists from the School of Education and Human Development, for helping to organize tonight's event. Please give them a hand. So tonight's panel offers the expertise of folks with a range of diverse experiences and perspectives on the issue of school shootings. All of these folks have strong ties to Colorado. You might note that there's a mix of researchers and educators and practitioners, folks who are dealing with this issue on a day-to-day basis. But they also have a national perspective to share. As you know, Colorado has been in the spotlight a number of times, particularly with some of our very public school shootings that have happened many years ago. And so these folks have had a lot of experience dealing with crises in schools and elsewhere. Let me introduce this wonderful panel. First, we have Andres Cardenas. He's a school resource officer in Aurora Central High School. He has served with Aurora PD for 7 years. For 3.5 years, he served as a school resource officer at Aurora Central High. After high school, SRO Cardenas opted to join the military and served in the US Navy for 12 years, serving 2 years on board the USS Constellation aircraft carrier during Operation Desert Shield for 2 years, and then 10 years in Naval Mobile Construction Battalions, participating in humanitarian relief for Hurricane Katrina, among other operations. In 2022, SRO Cardenas was awarded the Executive Citation from the National Association of School Resource Officers for his actions during a shooting that occurred near the school involving some students. Please welcome Andres Cardenas. Next, we have Professor Francie Kreppel-Hobson. She's professor and director of the school psychology program in the School of Education and Human Development. I don't feel like saying woohoo. One of my colleagues, right? At the University of Colorado, Denver. She's a licensed psychologist, a licensed school psychologist, and a member of the National Association of School Psychologists, School Safety and Crisis Response Committee, as well as Colorado Society of School Psychologists statewide crisis response team. As a member of these teams, Dr. C has provided comprehensive school-based prevention, crisis intervention, and post-vention crisis resources and services to school districts following incidents of violence and natural disasters around the country. She has authored and co-authored a number of articles in the areas of school safety, crisis response, and youth suicide. She is a sought-after commentator on major news networks like NBC, PBS, Edweek, CBS, and on and on and on. If you do a search for her on Google under news, you'll just see lots and lots of good stuff. So please welcome Dr. C. Next, we have Karen Singley Blair. Glad you could make it. Good to have you. That traffic is a mess. I live far away, so I get it. Just glad to have you here. Karen graduated from the University of Colorado, Denver. Awesome, with a master's in educational psychology in 1998. This is her 24th year as a school psychologist with the Aurora Public Schools and her 21st at Aurora Central High School, where she is also on the district crisis response team. After the shooting at the Aurora Theater in 2012, she was asked to join the Superintendent's Crisis Management Committee to help plan how to support both staff and students in the aftermath of that tragedy. She was named School Psychologist of the Year by the Colorado Society of School Psychologists in 2016, and was given the Educator Champion Award by Challenger Denver in 2017. It's awesome. She's been involved in crisis response for several acts of violence over the years. As a supporter of the Sandy Hook Promise, Karen agrees with and actively works toward their mission of protecting children from gun violence by encouraging and supporting solutions that create safer, healthier homes, schools, and communities. Please join me in welcoming Karen. And last but not least, we're happy to have Nate Thompson, who is Director of Social, Emotional, and Behavior Services at Littleton Public Schools. We remember Littleton. Nate Thompson is the Director of the Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Services for Littleton, as I said. In his 15 years there, he has helped to develop a comprehensive approach to mental health and safety that is widely recognized for its use of innovative technology, creative funding models, interagency partnerships, research, and student voice. Nate has extensive experience in school mental health services, crisis response, psychological safety protocols, and violence prevention, including leading the response to a school shooting. Previous to his current role, he worked as a nonprofit administrator, clinical supervisor, and therapist. And he is highly skilled at embarrassing dad jokes. Please join me in welcoming Nate. So that is our very distinguished panel. We will jump right into the questions. So first of all, thank you for participating in this panel event, our very first. Thank you for attending this event. We're glad to see all of you in the audience. I will ask each of the panelists the following questions. Questions likely will be asked in the order that they're listed unless there's a natural transition, right, that leads to another question or asking something out of order. The panel will last for an hour with roughly 15 minutes reserved for Q&A. So prepare your questions. So you'll have 45 minutes, panel, to answer these questions, and then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. We'll ask you to limit your response to 3 minutes. And so I will try to keep track of time as we go. And you can speak in any order you choose. So here's the first one. Can you speak to the intersections between your role and school shootings, either prevention or the immediate response or the longer term aftermath?
So I got involved with this work way back. I was actually a practitioner, a school psychologist when Columbine happened. And at the time we had no idea what we were doing. There were no protocols and procedures in place regarding prevention or intervention and that kind of thing. And so I've worked, a lot of my work has come from my experiences as a practitioner in terms of, finding best practices for school safety. And so that's, so I've had this wonderful opportunity as a practitioner, as a researcher, and continue to be involved in responding to schools to support the school community following acts of violence, as well as other kinds of incidents. And having responded, realizing the importance of taking steps to prevent different forms of violence in our schools and around our schools and involving youth so that we don't have to respond so much. So that's how that intersection worked for me.
Is this working? Oh, sorry. I can tell you as far as the police, we were in the same boat. When we first responded to Columbine, that was something that officers back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were taught that we would wait for SWAT, right? wait for SWAT. They're the professionals. They know how to deal with this stuff. But what was happening is we were learning as it happened in Uvalde, right? You wait for SWAT, and what's going on is carnage is going on. And that was a big learning point for PD, right? And I think around the country, so everybody took note of Colorado and Littleton. I could tell you that Littleton had response from all the way from Pueblo to from Boulder coming down to help out, and nobody knew what to do. And I think nowadays, as we've progressed in training, we've come to learn other tactics as far as even single officer entry and taking care of business, right? For lack of better words. And that's where we're at today as far as training goes in regards to shootings inside of schools.
Go ahead.
I was actually in my internship when Columbine happened. So it was kind of a crash course at that point for all of us interns on crisis response, because we were learning from those of you who were kind of learning by doing at that moment. It wasn't anything that we ever thought was going to become almost a daily occurrence like it has. Never did it enter our minds that we would be someday having this panel discussing the regularity of gun violence. But it was a really, I remember hearing from my professors about responding to that. And then working at Aurora Central for so long, and also just being on the district crisis team and having to respond to numerous, not necessarily active shootings, but just acts of violence, or maybe just learning a gun was on campus at some point, and all of the just fear of what could have happened, and there's students that you have to respond, and staff. Okay, no one got shot. However, and then you have to deal with their fear and their anxiety and try to establish a norm. So I guess in my role, I feel like I do the aftermath of the crisis response, but I also on a daily basis try to do a little prevention and trying to teach problem solving skills and conflict resolution. My friend Michelle is in the audience. We do a Be the Change Club. So we try to just have a sense of connection in the school so kids don't feel alone and they don't get to that point of feeling so desperate and angry. So it kind of like, for me, the whole gamut, I guess.
I'm Nate. Good to meet you all tonight. I feel really old sitting up here. But my first experience with big violence was I was living in Oklahoma at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing. And my first experience was working with some kids who lost their parents in that bombing. And it seems like my whole career has just been dealing with crisis. And I don't know, some people are called to that. I think it's just kind of what I was called to do. Have a relative who was shot at Columbine, and close to that experience. I was not a responder at that time. I was a clinician. But some of you may not know, Littleton School District is different than where Columbine is. Columbine's in Jefferson County Schools. But in Littleton, we also went through our own school shooting at Arapahoe High School, if you've heard about that one. But I've been involved with quite a few responses, helped a little bit in some of the centers at Aurora after the theater shooting, worked some with the STEM students, and worked with some other districts nationally. And I think the big thing for my role is 10 to 15 years ago, there wasn't a role like mine in most districts. Most school districts had a kind of special education department. They might have some school psychologists, and they had a school counseling team, but there really wasn't a role for somebody who's looking at things like suicidal students and threat assessments, and even things like child welfare and kids who get charged with crimes. And so through the years, I think the biggest change for me is school districts have had to adapt and create roles like mine because the burden on schools right now and the expectation, if you think about what we're balancing, the expectation that we treat kids all equitably and we don't suspend and expel kids. We really try to avoid that, with also the expectation that we keep schools safe. And we have this huge burden of doing things now that really historically were things that the FBI or Homeland Security did when we're talking about a full threat assessment on a student. And so the evolution that we've seen for K-12 schools really has been significant, and everybody across the nation's at a different place with that. But my role is really from the very front end in prevention, early intervention, our protocols for how we intervene with kids who may be in crisis, and then all the way through the end, which is the postvention and the response. And I do think just as Officer Cardenas was mentioning, mental health has made that same evolution of, back to Columbine, the mental health response was very different than what we're doing now. We learned we have to get in early and quick, and we can talk about some of those things if you want. But the model is very different than it was, 20 years ago with response.
So each of you has made some reference to this significant rise of school shootings over the past couple of decades, right? What has contributed to that? Why are we seeing so many?
I think for me, as far as working in schools and being from an inner city myself, being raised here in Denver, Colorado, I always wholeheartedly say it starts at home, right? Parenting, home life, what's going on at home. Is there a parent involved? Is there an adult involved? And then you could start going from there. Is there bullying involved in school? What's going on with the bullying? Do we know about it? Safe to tell, right? Those avenues that they could start communicating with us in regards. And I think with that, in conjunction with video games, the desensitization that our children are being exposed to with video games, gangs, socioeconomic, where they're at, also a cultural thing, I believe, as well. Many families just are in that's the culture of the family, be it in gangs. And that's what the child is being raised to believe.
I agree and there's multiple factors. School-associated gun violence in general is a really complex issue, and there's not one thing that we can point to that has created the situation we have right now. So there's a number of factors, and I don't think we can ignore things like systemic racism and discrimination in contributing to a decreased sense of safety, which can lead to increases in crime and violence. In addition, I don't think we've attended to school climate the way we really need to, which comes back to when we have this culture of bullying. I think that the hostile national discourse that's been going on for a number of years is contributing. I think we've had a number of folks in positions of power model some very bad behavior. And folks have gotten the message, young people, that violence is a way to solve problems. And that's how you act when you have a disagreement with someone. I think that kids are really struggling, particularly since the pandemic, in managing their behavior and their emotions. And schools are overwhelmed. The adults are struggling. And so supporting kids is just so much harder. And I don't think we've attended to those kinds of issues and their mental health needs. So I think all those things are coming into play, and families are struggling for a number of reasons. And I think in some contexts there is this culture of violence, if you will, as an acceptable form of problem solving and resolving conflict.
Yeah, Francie got at it's just so multifaceted, and not to just repeat everything you said, but I was just thinking about, what makes our country different than the other countries, because everyone went through a pandemic, everybody has social media, everybody, and everyone has video games. And I just keep thinking how we own more guns than there are people in this nation. We do have the political tension has been at such a high level for a while. And I think with the students I work with, they've just been so more of a mentality of us versus them, and almost like a dehumanizing of anyone who disagrees with you. And there isn't we used to be able to talk out problems, or even somebody told me the other day, we could take it out back and fight it out or whatever, fist fight, but now it's a knife fight or it's a gun. And there's not like a tolerance of disagreement. Like and I don't know really, I think it's just, there's many things that have led us to this place, where just being able to agree to disagree, people just find that so intolerable for some reason.
Well, I'll go maybe a little bit different direction. I think there is something around technology. And I think the way that I think about this is I heard, I think it was Gavin de Becker once say, we're people living with Stone Age brains in a space age technology. And I think part of that is the way that I think about this is why would one, kid do this and kind of click to the point of I need to go do school violence. I mean, clearly there's different types of violence, right? There's kind of the rampage shooter at a school. There's kind of the gang related, revenge kind of things. But I feel like part of it is a stress on the brain. And I feel like what we're asking our brains to do with the evolution of technology and social media is to input so much information and deal with things like, a conflict all of a sudden is now escalated on social media. And I'm watching, fights, right? A fight is like stopping and seeing an accident. So people watch fights on social media, it gets 1,000 clicks. So our brains are having to deal with so much information and input. And I think there's a certain number of brains in this world, a very small percentage that don't do well with that. And then all of a sudden it goes to, well, I'm gonna, whether it's revenge or, it's lack of regulation or it's reactionary, or maybe it is mental illness, goes to that next step. And so I do think as a society, we have to figure out, because this is one of the hardest things to understand is what makes someone go over that edge to do something this significant. And when you look at all the history of kind of significant players in violence, there is a time where you can see that they go to then, not just being frustrated and upset or, having something they're mad about, to then planning to do something terrible. And where is the click there? So I do think we need a lot more research into the brain around what is it that may be happening there that makes that turn happen. And it's just not a good science yet. It's really hard to know.
You mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to sort of see if you might expound on, panel. One was around the culture of violence. And I think about the sort of broader culture that is extolled in the media, right, around violence. And the fact that one can watch any number of movies and shows where people are being gunned down and enjoy that, right? You learn to enjoy that. So there's a level of desensitization maybe to that. And then somebody else talked about access to guns. And is there greater access to guns now than there was maybe 40 years ago?
Next mention that, and I forgot my response. But yeah, I don't think we can ignore access to firearms. When you combine accidents, suicides, and homicides, firearms are the #1 cause of death of youth in this country. And they are easily accessible. You ask kids, could you get a gun? Oh yeah, I could have one by tomorrow. It's easier to get than Sudafed, I think, anymore. And Karen's point around why are other countries not seeing this, I think, is an important one to consider. I'm actually working with a group on an article, and one of the co-authors is from the United Kingdom, and he was joking that we should title it, "Want to get shot in a school, come to America." Because it's not the same in other countries, and kids do have access to firearms, and I don't think we can ignore that, and I think that is absolutely related to the increase in all types of youth and school-associated gun violence.
I'll tell you, you mentioned England, right? England has one of the strictest gun laws in the world. Even the officers don't carry guns. Why? Because it's a cultural thing now. But believe it or not, England had transitioned from being ownership of gun owners. They had an incident that predates Columbine, the Dunbar massacre back in 96, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah.
It took that massacre of elementary children to change their laws, and which if you were a hunter, if you were collector, were the only people that could own firearms. I've visited all over parts of the world, visited Japan, where also very stringent on gun laws. Only detectives carry guns. So yes, it's a cultural thing, definitely. And I think in this country, because of our amendments, right? And, we got those hard left or hard right or center or whatnot, right? Political views. I think it's going to take a long time for us to realize that, yes, it's a gun, it's guns and the accessibility of guns to our youth nowadays. Just like you mentioned, you could talk to any kid in the school and I could tell them, how fast can you get a gun? And they could get these so-called ghost guns. They're bought at a store in pieces, and it circumvents the law, and they put it together, and they just have to drill a couple holes, and now you have a working firearm. So it's I know the ATF is trying to work on stuff like that. The government's trying to work on it, but it's just an uphill battle for us. Furthermore, you mentioned technology. You're right. One thing that I tell the kids all the time, and I learned this during our Digital Future Initiatives training that we do as SROs, I asked parents, would you give your 14-year-old the keys to the car right now? And they were like, no. And I said, well, why would you give him a phone that has given him access to everything without educating him about that, right? It's about educating the child and the phone usage and knowing what they're looking for, what they're looking at. You got so many websites out there that are just horrific. I know in my era was Faces of Death, I guess they called it,
Yeah.
which I didn't care much for. But nowadays you have stuff that these kids watch and it's normal for them. You could even see it in our movies in Hollywood. In my opinion, they're more gory, more blood, more guts. It's, what are we doing as a society to ourselves and our children?
Well, the next part of this question I want to ask you is, really what can we do about it, right? Particularly within families, schools, communities, and in the realm of policy to reduce gun violence. And so as you think about these questions, can you address, and we've talked about guns already in terms of that, but I think you started to hint, SRO Cardenas, at some potential policy solutions, and maybe you could share your idea in more detail. And related to that, can you, in what ways can prevention and response policies be racially conscious, gender conscious, and trauma informed? And how would that look in practice? So that's a lot of question there, but take whatever piece of it you want.
I think it has to take society as a whole to start realizing that we have to start pushing for policies, that common sense policies that help us, that get us in order to, one, work with each other, mental health experts, police, and figure out a way how to establish these policies, and then changing the culture of the people that are being affected by these policies. Training, I believe it's training on behalf of police officers. It's educating families. Knowing your demographics and who you're educating, knowing your public. There's so much facets that could be used to do this, but it's so hard because it's an uphill battle. Right now we have so many different demographics coming into our country that we're going to have to start worrying about in the near future. Now you got cultural beliefs, different languages that you have to cater to. So it's definitely going to be an uphill battle, but do I have the answer for that? I wish I did. Yeah, I would be a millionaire.
Well, and I can speak to one. I think so. We in Colorado, I think we're ahead of the nation in what we call student threat assessment, right? And so some of you are probably familiar with that. And that's, really a model where, you get a team of folks together that represent different disciplines, and you really assess the level. In our district, we call it the level of concern about a student, and that really guides your actions. And I do think what's interesting about that is when you look at the disproportionality we have in school discipline. So if you look at school discipline all across Colorado and really the nation, there's a lot of disproportionality in discipline when it comes to different racial and ethnic groups and kids with disabilities and other things. But when you actually look at the data on threat assessment, it's actually more proportional and a fairer process than school discipline is. And the reason for that, I think, is the hypothesis that's out there is because you actually have a team of folks who are using a structured process to go through that, make decisions based on some protocols that guide you through it, as opposed to school discipline, which most of the time is a principal or an assistant principal or a dean sitting down going, okay, you did this, this is what I'm gonna do, you're out for 3 days, right? And so in some ways, there's some good pieces to that. Now, if you're a student who's ever gone through a threat assessment or a family, it's really tough. It's really traumatic. You feel targeted. And even if you may have said something that was in the heat of the moment or was taken differently, it's a serious process. But I do think the more we can use some of those structured protocols as a team, we are going to see that there's less disproportionality in some of that. And so I just want to put that out there as one tool. I think the same thing with suicide intervention. If we train our folks to really do that with fidelity, we're going to see that it's not going to be as disproportionate in 1A. So just one thought on that.
Along with that, we do a program called Signs of Suicide where we do teach kids to say something. And then talking about Sandy Hook Promise has a lot on their website, like a lot of statistics and programs and ideas. So they have something called Say Something Week. So I do think a lot of it is an education for kids to know kind of what to look for and to not feel like they're being a snitch, because no one wants to be a snitch. But there was a couple years ago, there was something on Instagram and it was a whole different Central High School in a whole nother area of the country. But our kids spoke up, didn't they? We got messages, somebody's threatening our school, somebody's threatening. And so I'm like, okay, this education we're doing is helping. They're speaking up. They know what to look for. They know what the warning signs are. And we just, that's one of the things that I think is really important.
So I'm glad that both threat assessment and suicide came up, because you can't talk about youth gun violence without talking about suicide, because it is a leading cause of death, and it is a form of violence. And it also comes back to accessibility of means like firearms. But there are some things that we know are effective in preventing violence and at the same time reducing some of these disparities that we see in exclusionary disciplinary practices. We for a very long time, and sadly in some places still rely on zero tolerance policies when kids make threats or engage in threatening behavior, and that doesn't solve the problem. In fact, if we remove kids from schools, we can actually make them less safe, because now the kid isn't being monitored, isn't getting supports. It doesn't address the problem. And so, having common sense disciplinary policies and procedures that focus more on restorative practices and the use of threat assessment, which allows us to determine, at least to some degree, does this kid actually pose a threat, versus maybe he made a threat or engaged in threatening behavior. There are some things we can do. So putting those kinds of things in place, not doing away with those zero tolerance policies, focusing on school climate, and including focusing on tolerance and acceptance of differences, whatever those are, can go a long way. We know it, and it's too bad that this has become politicized. And I think we just need to come back to what's the common ground, and the common ground is we want our schools to be safe and we want our kids not to die. We just need to come together in terms of let's really look at what the data says in terms of what's the best way to get there.
Thank you. So we are running out of time. I'm going to ask two big questions and give you like 2 seconds to answer. And then we're going to, because we want to get to the audience before you run away, because people are already starting to leave. So As you know, higher ed is not immune to this. We just saw a recent shooting in Pennsylvania on a college campus, and I can think of Virginia and other places. Are there resources that would be worthwhile for us in higher ed as we think about how to impact positively gun violence in schools? And then the other question I'll ask, and maybe you can decide who answers what are the drawbacks and benefits to having media coverage of school shootings?
I can take that one. Yeah, somebody wants to do the other one, I can take that one.
Okay, great.
Do you want me to start with that one?
Yeah.
With the media? Okay, so here's what I've learned through all of these incidents is that the media seeks their story. They don't seek recovery. They don't seek to support anybody involved in the situation. They are there for their main job, which is to write a story that's going to get clicks, that's going to get revenue. And if you remember that, and that's really what their job is and what they're doing, it will help you. I really think it can actually make things significantly worse. I'll give you one example. You know, we went through our school shooting. You know, the media is immediately trying to get information out there. And I would tell you in any shooting, there's a ton of information that comes out quickly that is wrong. And so I've learned anytime something comes out to just take it with a grain of salt, because a lot more will be learned later. But one of the examples we had was they put out a map within a day or two of the shooting and showed here exactly is where the shooting happened in the school, and it was in the wrong place. And so as students came back to school, nobody wanted to go in that room. And we could not convince the students it didn't happen in there, right? The area we have is blocked off, but that's just one example. The other is that the media very often works with victims and bystanders and everybody else and tries to play this role. Some of them are very sophisticated at tell me your story, tell me all about, right? And they play this role of like, I'm gonna be your therapist. I'm gonna let you, and people in shock and trauma fall right into that because they need to talk and they need to share their experience. That's a part of healing. But what happens then is they say things that very often they go back later and go, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I said that. I didn't know I acted that way. And so we have to be really thoughtful. And this isn't even considering the whole conversation about media coverage and suicide, which is a whole nother issue. But we have to be really thoughtful in how we keep the media at bay when we recover from these incidents. The last thing I'll just share is I remember working in a group of students who were very impacted and close to the violence in our school shooting. And the media had snuck in, and we were at a church and they snuck in and were trying to act like being a parent and to be a part of that support group that we were doing. So never underestimate the lengths that people will go to get that story. And you have to fight really hard when you're leading a mental health recovery to protect people from that and actually to educate your students, your staff, your leaders about all of that. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
No, also in addition to that, a lot of times when we get new students transferring to Central, they're one of the first questions is how safe is it? They have read things, they have heard things. So the media can often just increase that level of fear and anxiety, even when nothing has really happened in our building, around our building, and like in the neighborhood, but in the building, I feel is pretty safe. And I also think of the copycats, the people who they weren't even alive when Columbine happened, but they watch the tapes. They come here. It's like a sacred place to them where they want to be, and they still travel to see the place where Columbine happened. And so again, media kind of exacerbates that because all the footage is there for them to watch over and over.
I think there's a lot of opportunity for higher ed to partner with pre-K-12 schools around. I mean, folks who are boots on the ground in the schools don't have time to necessarily do research or even go to the professional literature or find out about what are best practices or what are effective policies and procedures. But we do in higher ed. I mean, that's part of our job. And so I think that we could, partnering around providing information, helping to educate the community and support them in implementing change is something that higher ed could do. And certainly, I think that there are certain schools and colleges and individual programs that can really support those efforts in really meaningful and powerful ways.
It is educating the student populace in regards to what signs to look for, what signs of distress to look for, and knowing that, hey, this person's acting a little off. That's not his persona. That's not how he is. Or he's doing something. He's giving things away that he typically doesn't. Anything of the sort, I think, is educating staff and student body in regards to looking for these signs that, you know, potentially could be dangerous and potentially could be not, you know, but it's rather safe than sorry, as they say, right?
Thank you. Would you give this great panel a hand, please? Few minutes for questions from the audience.
Everyone know we are recording today's session, so I will ask for questions to be spoken to the mic.
Would you agree that the causes of gun violence are often misappropriated? Switzerland has some of the highest gun ownership laws, while South Korea and Japan have some of the highest violent video game rates. Why is the US different?
Again, I think it's a cultural thing, how we've been brought up with our laws and our policies. And yes, those countries do have firearms as well, right? But it's a cultural thing, I believe, that it falls into how they're raised. I'll give you an example. Alcohol, for example, in Italy. I lived in Sicily for 4 years. Alcohol is not viewed as something that you go out and get smashed with the youth. It's drunk at home, a glass of wine. It's nothing that's, in particular, like Americans, when they go out and get smashed, you know, like not everybody, our youth, that was like, for me, eye-opening. It's a cultural thing, I believe.
And I do think that I think it is absolutely cultural and comes back to, in part, the very loud voices who remind us frequently of our Second Amendment rights. And that seems to have become kind of a free-for-all and not what it was originally intended to be. Instead, it's become this is my right, and I do think that part of it is this, what I said earlier around this divisiveness that's occurring in our country and seems to be spiraling, and this lack of acceptance of not just a difference of opinion, but any kind of difference, and this us versus them kind of mentality, I think, is contributing.
Hi, thank you folks very much for all your input. My name is Debbie Duran, and I'm a doctoral of criminal justice candidate, also retired military and federal law enforcement. So that's my background. But through my research, well, one thing, we'll just say the US Constitution contributes to gun violence. The Second Amendment, you know, the NRA, we have powerful organizations over there that we fight against as far as trying to reduce gun violence just in general. But one of the issues that we do have culturally in this country is that there are hunters out there and they teach their children how to shoot guns at a very young age. So that's a big problem. And then as far as policy change, we need to look at law enforcement enhancing security. I understand the psychological piece, but also, you know, looking at maybe establishing what I would say a restricted area, maybe have some more officers patrol the outside, and then the controlled area where you have, you know, like what you do in the RSOs. And then I would consider the schools themselves as the exclusion area. So I just kind of highlighted what a nuclear site's about. So I have a nuclear weapon. I have a nuclear weapons background. So I would look at schools as maybe addressing it from that perspective. But yes, it starts with parents and access and educating kids on how to use weapons and their children, and, they're going to continue to be intrigued. And then, the video games, the violent video games, sometimes that becomes a reality. So something to look at. Yeah.
To have another
Thank you,
expert,
by the
that's
way.
great. That's another question. Thank you.
Well, she's moving around. I did want to respond to that, and I agree. We do need to attend to physical safety, but we also have to attend to psychological safety. And if we don't have that balance, we're not going to have safe schools.
Thank you, panel, for being here. I'm a former 7th grade language arts teacher. And so, yeah. So my question is really for you. How do you, you were talking about this, concern group for, you're doing the threat assessment. How do you give staff and teachers time to do that? And how do you give, and furthermore, how do you give staff and teachers time to get to know their students outside of developing them academically and their intellectual capabilities?
So good. That's such a great question. I do think that's one of the things that our public schools are dealing with right now is just the time to do what we're asked to do, and this burden, right, that we feel of this is the place where all the kids are in the community, and we're asking you to get to know them and do social emotional learning and teach them all these things, and also get good test scores, and right, and then you got to do your duty, and it is a lot, right? And I don't think it's a surprise of why we're losing people from the teaching profession or the educational profession, because those expectations are huge, and the funding has not kept up with those expectations of the community or the legislation, frankly, that's coming from down the street here that makes us do additional things. So I think the best we can do really is, one, we need to have a philosophy of the whole child in our schools. And I think part of that is giving time, right, for connecting with your students and making sure that, yeah, academics are really important, but we do want you to know the kids in your classes. And we do need to have ways in our schools, especially our bigger schools, for kids to connect with a trusted adult. And so there's different ways to do that. In our district, one of the things we're starting right now is a mental health essentials curriculum that our teachers are teaching to their students. That's about their brain, and kind of how your brain reacts when you're anxious, and how your brain reacts on relationships and social media and drugs. And we're using that as a way for staff to connect with kids and say, yeah, this is kind of what it was like for me growing up, and also hopefully for the adults to learn those skills as well, right? How do you regulate your heartbeat, those kind of things. So that's one strategy we're trying. I don't know if anybody else wants to add, but it's a really hard challenge, right? To do all those things as a classroom teacher.
Does active shooter training help or hurt?
Well, I don't know. You want to answer that one? I mean, it depends on the person, probably, right? Some people really like that as a structured way to say, I know what I'm doing in an incident, and then you have other people who are very triggered by it.
On that one, active shooter drills are very controversial, and they get often, that term is often used in the same context of lockdowns, and they're two different things. And there's actually empirical evidence that traditional lockdowns do keep kids safer and can reduce loss of life. And when we do these drills, the whole idea is to build muscle memory, right? So that when there's an actual emergency, kids and staff, everybody knows what to do. And that does keep people safer. There are some states that, and some perhaps districts locally, that are doing active shooter drills, which is a different thing where
You're talking about live action.
Well, I'm talking
Active
about
shooters.
a lockdown is in response to any kind of threat.
Right.
Yeah, inside the school, versus active shooter drills is very specific around there's somebody in the building who's gonna, shoot everybody, which, by the way, is a very rare occurrence. The vast majority of youth homicides happen outside of the school setting. Just wanted to put that out there. But there's absolutely no evidence that active shooter drills increase safety. And actually, if they're done very poorly, can be traumatizing.
Yeah, live action for sure, yeah.
One more question, then we're going to have to close.
Hello, panel. I'm just a first-year college student, so I don't really have that much experience in this field, but a question I wanted to ask is, has there ever been a time where certain people or certain communities don't want the help or intervention that you guys are trying to offer? And what is an approach, or how have you possibly approached this in the past?
I could talk to that. We've had families migrate from Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, Central and South America, and policing in those countries are way different, right? It's no secret that Mexico, Central, South America, lots of the police agencies are corrupt, and so police we're viewed as the no-go, right? So for us to educate them in the law or educate them about school and school safety is hard, not only because of the cultural differences, but of also language barriers. Thankfully, my coworker, he's from Rwanda, and he speaks Swahili, French, Kinyarwanda, and other dialects. And so he could reach out to the African population as well. One thing that we're putting together right now is Aurora PD. I can't speak to other agencies, but they're putting a panel together with officers of different ethnicities. We have an officer from Afghanistan. We have DJ, which is from Rwanda. Myself, my background is Mexican. I speak Spanish. And so we're putting a panel together to reach out to the families where we could be in a kind of like presence like this, and nothing that's just, you know, one-on-one where it's more intimidating for them. And so an open forum is what we're trying to do, and having a Q&A pretty much, and having questions that they could ask of us. I tell you that every time I contact a South or Central American, they are just terrified. And I always start with, hey, I'm a municipal cop. I'm not federal. I don't care about your legal status. That's not my purview. And I have to open up like that. And I could see just like this weight come off of them. And so I don't know what different departments are doing, but I know that we're gearing towards that route. I can tell you, Aurora is one of the most diversified cities in Colorado. So that's kind of what we're doing in that regard.
And I just have to brag because I know it's been kind of controversial with Denver Public Schools kind of getting rid of the SROs, and then what happened at East, and now they're back. But I've always worked with such great, and Officer Cardenas and DJ are great. They will take, when my some of the students on my caseload in special ed have cognitive disabilities, and after the Nome Park shooting, they were afraid to walk home. And you guys took the time to kind of like hear them out, route a different way to go home. You can go this way and not go through the park, you know. But it's DJ coaches golf. I mean, they really do partner with our kids. They're not seen as the school to prison pipeline or whatever people are afraid of with the police in the schools. They're there. Kids, they build relationships. Kids feel safer. They're there to answer questions. It's really the ideal version of what a school resource officer should be. And we're very lucky to have the two that we have.
Yeah, I echo that. I echo that as well. I think our SROs sometimes are the only positive relationship some of our kids ever have with law enforcement. And so they're a really important piece of what we do for safety.
And I do think it's important to differentiate between a well-trained SRO who's truly a resource officer and part of the school community, and you know, maybe like security, or a police officer who's hired by the school to provide security, who is not trained to work with kids and work in the school setting. Then then things can go awry, certainly.
Really quick, Dean Lynn, if you don't mind, just because we've had so much great conversation and so many great questions from the audience, and I know I haven't had a chance to get all the way through, could we really quick ask the panel, what's a good way to continue this conversation? Do you recommend reaching out with questions, or anyone who might be watching this recording later, where do you recommend for people who have questions to go to for next resources?
I mean, I would be fine being the point of contact, and it can field whatever questions folks have, and we'll invite these folks to, you know, if there's questions specific to them. So, because I'm here at the university, so people can easily contact me here.
I'm
could-
also happy to stick around for a little bit. if
I was
people
gonna
have
say the
questions
same
out
thing,
there.
but Nathan, like, we can stick around. I could stick around. I'm not in no hurry, so.
Yeah, because I
That was
do
gonna be
think there
my
was,
question, is
there
if
was
you
one
all will stick
hand that
around.
was up like the whole time, and I don't mind, I don't mind waiting for answering this question.
Thank you. I have to collect my train of thought. Well, I was just curious, like, because I know some of you mentioned like violence, like violent video games, violent movies, things like that being a huge problem. But here I am, true crime lover, and like wearing my Halloween shirt, matching backpack. And so my question is like, are parents just not giving the correct messaging around that? Because like I was always taught, even viewing these things, like you use your words, you don't, you know, like go to violence. And so is it parents that are giving incorrect messaging? Is it friends? Is it a combination? Like, are people just not learning how to deal with violence correctly when they're confronted with it?
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Christiana.
Christiana, you hit it on the nail. You were taught, is what you said. You were taught that we use our words, right? And you're right. I wholeheartedly believe it begins in the home, because that's the first structure the child is going to have. And you said you were taught. I believe that a lot of parents, I've seen it with my own family. I've told my nieces that have kids, I'm like, hey, you have to reach your child. You can't just stick them in front of a TV and think that's okay. You were taught. I'm trying to work with our analysts to get statistics. But I was talking to this kid and I was asking him what the whole premise of Grand Theft Auto, GTA was. And he says, it's steal cars and to jack people. And I'm just like, what? And so I started doing research on my behalf. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was a governor, tried to ban these games back in the early 2000s. But these corporations had so much backing and funding and lobbying that they got it through. I think that had he done that and had it been successful, I don't think we'd be what. And the reason I was working with my analyst was I wanted to find out how many of our carjackings, just in Aurora alone, are associated with juveniles. Every carjacking that I've taken or seen or heard of, juveniles. With guns, with knives, majority with guns. And I wholeheartedly think it's a parenting thing. It starts at the home. It starts with not educating the child, letting them be, and it's just the vicious cycle that keeps going on.
I just want to say one other thing about that, because I agree. And I think sometimes we have parents and families raising kids who don't have their own capacity, right? For whatever life circumstance, mental health, whatever it is, that can't provide that. But here's the other thing that I think I've learned through the years is we have to educate kids about their brains, because there's a reason your brain likes true crime. There's a reason we like to talk about things. There's a reason we scroll through certain things and stop on certain things. And it's because our brain is attracted to those. And the reason is because our brain is trying to keep us safe. Our brain is trying to figure out threats in our environment and is attuned to those things that are graphic, that are potentially scary. And so that's what I say. I say our brains are in a stress. It's because it's overload, right? Our brains are designed to keep us safe through all these sensory inputs, but it's on such overload that we have to train kids to understand how to detox from screens, to detox from those sensory inputs. And that's what really, really worries me when you combine that with the lack of kind of social support, family support, guidance. Then there's going to be a certain percentage of kids and even adults who go to that level of violence.
We're going to let that be the last word. Thank you, panelists, for